Welcome to Sins of Omission, Stories the Media Overlook. We have a wonderful panel for which I'd like to thank Mark Rabinowitz, whose website, oilempire.us, is an incomparable resource for anyone interested in such issues as JFK, 9/11, disinformation, and so on. My own baptism into this topic, among others, came courtesy of 9/11. Prior to that, I was an average politically correct, knee-jerk liberal New Yorker who believed, to the extent I thought about it at all, that the media, particularly our own New York Times, gave a fairly undistorted view, using the word fairly in both its senses, of the important stories going on in the world. But with 9/11, which took place while my son attended Stuyvesant High School, located 4 blocks north of Ground Zero, I got a ringside seat to that circus in which the government practices sleight of hand while the media play the role of the graciously accommodating magician's assistant. As everyone now knows, but few then believed, the kids at Stuyvesant, like downtown's residents and office workers, not to mention the Ground Zero workers, were exposed to record-breaking levels of over 2,000 contaminants, which, it has been shown, the Environmental Protection Agency not only should have known about, but did know about. That subtle but significant distinction is a prime example of a story which the mainstream media have left unexamined. And yet their tricks in camouflaging the truth were, like the virtuoso magicians, not only abundant, but also mercurial, so that as soon as the handful of activists following the issue figured out one, the magician moved on to the next. To quote no less a master sleight-of-hand artist than Karl Rove, "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out." With one or two isolated exceptions, the foremost being Juan Gonzalez of the New York Daily News, the media did not join us few activists in probing for data or asking such choice but telling questions as, why are you focusing only on asbestos? What about the hundreds, if not thousands, of other toxic substances released by the collapse of the buildings and the fires that were allowed to burn and smolder freely for at least 3 months? Or when a waste transfer station was placed less than 20 yards from Stuyvesant in violation of state, local, and federal law, you say it's an emergency, but there's no longer any hope of finding survivors. So what is the emergency for which the health of the school students, faculty, and staff is being placed in jeopardy? Instead, in partnership with the government, the media practiced a don't ask, don't tell policy, which was allowed to continue because the public had its attention glued to the sword-wielding, swarthy enemy in Afghanistan. That public is smarter now, but as Karl Rove pointed out, it's too late. The government has moved on to even greater disasters, hurricanes, droughts, and wars, and besides, there's a whole new generation of suckers who've come of age since then. Not only did the media remain compliant as lobotomy patients, they did so even in the face of testimony from experts and first-hand witnesses at hearings being held at all levels of government. How could this happen? One way was that the federal government was allowed to control state and local hearings by demanding to be heard first, since they knew that by lunchtime, a large portion of the TV press would have to leave to edit their stories in time for, say, the 5 p.m. news slot. Besides, the media were not interested in presenting a fair and balanced report, only in getting 1 or 2 sound bites from someone with an official title. At times, conflicting information was dutifully reported, but buried deep in the article, or the article itself was nestled into a low-profile section of the paper. In the case of the symptoms which manifested themselves early on, that news came couched in terms of fear, thus allowing physical symptoms to be patronizingly blamed on psychosomatic factors, and that continues until this day. And then there is the issue of access, the threat that if you don't play by the administration's rules, you'll no longer get those portentous sound bites, your competitor will. Here's a quote from Rigorous Intuition, a website. "The way to read the Washington Post, and I suppose this applies to any newspaper in any city that you live in, is certain reporters have certain beats. They develop contacts with certain politicians, and if you know that, and if you know who they're talking to every day, you can just sort of know by whose byline is on the story where their information is coming from. So you don't read it as this reporter's story, you read it as the politician using this writer to say something." The issue of access or government favor has been going on at least since World War II, when reporters agreed not to reveal the end of the war in the European theater, until it was formally announced the following day. The pact was broken by Associated Press correspondent Edward Kennedy because the military had broken it first by allowing the news to be broadcast in Germany. Kennedy was fired and an apology not issued until 2012 when Kennedy's daughter published a memoir on the subject. This stranglehold of the media by the government would be fine if it was understood by the public. But unlike the former Soviet Union, we still operate under the illusion that we have a free press. And as Joseph Goebbels knew so well, it is easier to put over a big lie than a small one, since the public will be unable to believe the media, quote, could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously, unquote. In addition to the manipulation of the press by politicians, we have their handmaidens, the banks or corporations. According to the late great researcher John Judge, the ownership of all 4 major television networks was secretly held through interlocking directorates by the Rockefeller family since the 1940s, until it passed openly into the hands of General Electric for NBC. Remember, what's good for GE is good for the country. And to Capital Cities, Bill Casey's stock investment company. ABC is under their auspices. In other words, specifically words which have been attributed to William Randolph Hearst, news is something someone doesn't want you to know. Everything else is advertising. We see the results of this practice in the news about everything from climate change to the financial crisis. Case in point. While investigating HSBC Bank, Peter Oborne, a reporter for the British paper The Telegraph, now comes a long quote, said one former Telegraph executive told him HSBC was the advertiser you literally cannot afford to offend. Oborne said, late last year, I set to work on a story about the international banking giant HSBC. Well-known British Muslims had received letters out of the blue from HSBC informing them that their accounts had been closed. No reason was given, and it was made plain that there was no possibility of appeal. It's like having your water cut off, one victim told me. When I submitted it for publication on the Telegraph website, I was at first told there would be no problem. When it was not published, I made inquiries. I was fobbed off with excuses, then told there was a legal problem. When I asked the legal department, the lawyers were unaware of any difficulty. When I pushed the point, an executive took me aside and said that there's a bit of an issue with HSBC. Eventually, I gave up in despair and offered the article to Open Democracy. I researched the newspaper's coverage of HSBC and learned that Harry Wilson, the admirable banking correspondent of The Telegraph, had published an online story about HSBC based on a report from a Hong Kong analyst who had claimed there was a black hole in the HSBC accounts. This story was swiftly removed from the Telegraph website, even though there were no legal problems. In the middle of Oborne's efforts to get his story out, the Telegraph ran another story, which was known to be false, about a woman with 3 breasts. That's rule number 1 of the magician's playbook. Look over there, to distract the audience from your sleight of hand, and what better way to do that than with sex? Oborne resigned from the Telegraph, a move which is being repeated around the globe. Some examples. 20-year CBS News veteran Sharyl Attkisson details massive censorship and propaganda in mainstream media. Editor in Asia leaves Bloomberg News citing censorship. Google Transparency Report, worldwide government censorship requests up 26%. And meet Amber Lyon, former reporter exposes massive censorship at CNN. With respect to the New York Times, here's an excerpt from an interview in the German magazine Der Spiegel of New York Times editor, I don't know how to say it, Bakiat, does anyone know how to say it? No. Spiegel, one of your best reporters, James Risen, said in a speech that the mainstream failed after 9/11. Do you agree? Answer, yes, absolutely. The mainstream press was not aggressive enough after 9/11. Was not aggressive enough in asking questions about a decision to go to war in Iraq. Was not aggressive enough in asking the hard questions about the war on terror. I accept that for the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. By what mechanism is this across-the-board censorship possible? Now comes a quote from Nathaniel Blumberg's The Afternoon of March 30th, which is about the assassination attempt of President Reagan. The American news media have been deeply penetrated by our intelligence community. Confirmation of everything I've been saying on that score came less than 2 weeks ago, and I've been waiting for just the right moment to pass it on. It comes from no less a source than the New York Times. I would like to say that it was the lead story on page 1, but alas, as usual, it was buried at the bottom of the 14th page of the second section on June 9th. That story, my good and patient friends, reports that the Central Intelligence Agency, in order to settle a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act, reluctantly disclosed, those are the words of the good gray lady herself, that means the New York Times, that journalists have been used in a variety of roles and missions. Among other duties, journalists provided cover or served as a funding mechanism. Some provided non-attributable material for use by the CIA. Some collaborated in or worked on CIA-produced materials or were used for the placement of CIA-prepared materials in the foreign media. Some journalists had even served as couriers and as case officers who secretly supervised other agencies and agents. And some, oh, it's been a long time a coming, provided assistance in suppressing what the CIA termed a media item, such as a news story. Lest Blumberg be unknown to the listener, and therefore suspect, although he was a journalism professor, here's a quote from CIA Director Robert Gates in a memo entitled Greater CIA Openness. According to the memo, the CIA Public Affairs Office, quote, has relationships with reporters from every major wire service, newspaper, news weekly, and television network in the nation. This has helped us turn some intelligence failure stories into intelligence success stories, and it has contributed to the accuracy of countless others. In many instances, we have persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold, or even scrap stories that could have adversely affected national security interests or jeopardized sources and methods. This control of the media by the intelligence agencies, which has been investigated in depth by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame, among others, came of age following World War II, when patriotic Americans, including some journalists, were proud to do their part for Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's campaign to stamp out communism. For that's the magician's ultimate distraction. Better than soccer, better even than sex. The enemy. In the 1950s, a communist, and these days, a terrorist. Bread and circuses, or what the CIA's Frank Wisner called the mighty Wurlitzer, are fine as long as the going is good. But when things get tough, an electric shock by way of a terror attack can be counted on to galvanize the sheeple into obedience. Thank you. First guest is Court Dorsey. Court Dorsey is a founding member of Bright Morning Star, a folk cabaret ensemble that toured for 16 years, including with Pete Seeger and Odetta. He is also a mediator, facilitator, and circle keeper who has developed conflict resolution theater, a process he uses in many settings, especially with young people, including as a guest lecturer at the Kahn Institute and the School of Education, Smith College, as well as with Hampshire Education Collaborative's Unlocking the Light program in juvenile detention facilities. He is a frequent guest artist at Amherst College, and he's here with us today as the playwright of Project Unspeakable, a community building initiative to challenge the official silence that for decades has surrounded the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy. Court Dorsey, welcome.
Hello. So I thought I might start with just a short introduction about Project Unspeakable to let you know what it is and how it got going. There's a book by a man named James Douglas called JFK and the Unspeakable. It's probably one of the most thorough pieces of research on the Kennedy assassination to date. It's a 400-page book, and 100 pages of it is footnotes, just to make sure that you don't think he's just some weirdo. He has proved with references every allegation that he comes up with. So, and he's an amazing human being. He came to do a workshop at the Rocamp and Conference Center, and I was invited to direct a production of another play that had been based on his book. And while I was there, he also did the workshop with Paul Schrade. Paul Schrade was took the first bullet in the Robert Kennedy assassination. He was with Robert Kennedy and took the first bullet before Robert Kennedy's was shot. And he was there as a labor on the campaign worker in Kennedy's run for president. This was in 1968. And Paul Schrade was there, and he has been struggling to reopen Sirhan Sirhan's case. Sirhan Sirhan is supposedly the assassin of Robert Kennedy. And no, it's no problem. Come on right in.
Thank you.
And so Paul Schrade has been trying to get that case reopened. So Jim is now writing a book about the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and the role of, and Robert Kennedy, and the role of the, what do we want to call it, deep state, intelligence forces, various government agencies in collaboration with financial interests that had hands in these assassinations. Talk about stories that have been covered up. So I decided at that point it would be a good idea to try to find a way to get these stories out, and being inspired by the Laramie Project, which did an awful lot to bring issues of gay and lesbian rights to the mainstream, thought, why not do a play about this? Well, it was a little bit of a crazy idea, because not only could you do one play about one aspect of one of these men's lives, to try to do one play about four of these leaders was quite an undertaking, and we're still working on it. But that's how the project began. And so it's really two stories. One story is the story of the evidence and the background about these four assassinations. The other story is about communities of people getting together to take a history that has been denied to them and that the corporate media is not going to give to them, and meeting in communities, reading through a script that we make available to them at no cost, and then being in community to discuss what are the implications of that information. So first of all, when you read, so we make these scripts available, and the script, I'm going to give you a short excerpt. We have several different versions of it. There's a 20-minute version for quick hits. There's a 45-minute version for like conference-length productions. There's a 90-minute version, which is often used for Reader's Theater kind of productions. And then there's the full 130 minutes, which we boil down from 7 hours. That's used more often for two-night seminars, things like that, as well as an annotated version that gives all the background material. That when you read this collection of quotes, instead of being like a person at a movie or at a theater where you're in a passive position, you take in information and go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, remain passive and go on to the next bit of information. Here you're actually using your voice to voice the voices of these historical characters. The position is an active position. So already some of the passivity that we get into by consuming culture is done away with. So that's the other part of this story. And when you take in this information, you're in a community of people that you can talk about it with right away. So you're not getting it on a computer or reading it in a book, wonderful as those things are, but where you find yourself dealing with this information and taking it in and processing it without anyone else to talk to, which creates an isolation. So that we're all brilliant in our isolation, but not necessarily active in our isolation. But reading a play in a group of other people and then talking about it right away, not only are you active, but you're also active in a community where people are also active with you. So the empowerment model of reading theater together or reading history together is one part of the story. The other is the story that this play is about, which is of these four assassinations. So the last thing that I want to say before I jump into this clip is that I felt, as someone who was alive for these assassinations, that I understand, especially by the last one, by Robert Kennedy's assassination, after Malcolm X, John Kennedy, and Martin Luther King had already been killed, how weird it seemed that another lone nut came up and killed a man who was running and who was taking the lead as a peace candidate, as an anti-war candidate in 1968. Isn't it ironic? Isn't it coincidental? Isn't it a weird coincidence that all four of these powerful leaders at that time, and this was before the great, change into horizontal leadership that we've seen with Occupy and the anti-nuclear movement, we were closer to that top-down leadership model in the 60s, that the four real spokespeople for this movement, this generational movement, were shot down. That remembered that needed to speak up about it before history just slides along and these men are forgotten and the fact of this is forgotten. But in doing that, how is that relevant to people that are alive now? And that becomes a problem. Why? You don't want to just be talking about your history. A bunch of old people talking about their history, it's kind of stupid. But in order to solve that problem, we decided to work with an equity company here in New York, and we've now had 2 laboratories that were mostly consisted of African American, mostly women, and mostly young, but also some men and a few white people as well, to work with this material to try to rewrite it as a script, as a theatrical script. Because the documentary version, which I'm going to read you some today, is good on the history. It's good on the facts. It's all historical quotes and narration. But it's not the kind of thing that theaters are going to want to do. It's not the kind of thing that's going to go, kind of viral, that's going to catch on. The Laramie Project worked both. Did you know the Laramie Project? How many people here know about the Laramie Project? The name of the guy, Matthew Shepard, was killed and kind of brutally in Laramie, Wyoming. And his story, a theater company from New York went out and interviewed people in the town there and wrote a play about it over time. And that play became so well known and so well read, and it was known both in theaters and personally. And people would read it in circles a little bit. And it really helped to jumpstart the gay and lesbian rights movement. I don't know, it was maybe 20 years ago, I want to say. And it's still being read today. But that element of being done in theaters is part of what gets the word out that people can read this in groups. So we are also doing right now another version which will be performed in theaters. It's rewritten, and so I'll tell you if there's time later what the new script looks like and how it's different from the one that you're going to hear now. All right, so I thought what I would do now is just give you a short excerpt of the kind of thing that you'd see if you read the whole play. And I'm going to do all the voices myself, so imagine that all the different characters would be read by different people in a circle, either in a living room reading, which sometimes happens, or as a reader's theater piece, so that you have a couple of rehearsals and bring people in to hear it. Okay, so Tanae is the main character, and Tanae is the character that's on the search, on the quest. And then there's a couple of narrators. So, my friends, thank you for coming. I'm so glad you're here. I need someone to talk to. I can't sleep. It started with this one dream. There were all these doctors and nurses huddled around a gurney, but the doctors and nurses were gagged, and they had their hands tied behind their backs like this. And then I realized I was in an autopsy, because on the gurney was the dead body of a president, President Carter. And all around the room were these generals and admirals and FBI agents. The president sat up on the table, he looked me right in the eye, and he said, "America does not at the moment have a functioning democracy." Now I'm going to say again that all of the quotes that are attributed to people, to real historical people, are actual quotes in this play. So Carter says, "America does not at this moment have a functioning democracy." Well, there was another man in the shadows, Tanae says. I couldn't see his face, but his voice was clear. "The murder of the president is not a mystery. But President Carter isn't murdered. Any citizen who is willing to look can see clearly who killed President Kennedy." And when I looked back at the table in my dream, I saw that it wasn't Carter, it was President Kennedy, and the back of his head was gone. And standing behind him was a black man that reminded me of Martin Luther King, and he reached out his hand and he said, "The question is now, what will you do with that?" And I can't shake this dream. I need to sort it out. I'm going to skip some. But I'm not a conspiracy theorist. A witness of a crime who just stands by tends by that very fact to become an accomplice. That's Thomas Merton, Trappist monk and author. So Tanay says, how am I an accomplice to the Kennedy assassination? Feminist Gloria Steinem. The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Thomas Merton, from his book, Raids on the Unspeakable. The unspeakable is the void that contradicts everything that is spoken even before the words are said. The void that gets into the language of public and official declarations at the very moment when they are pronounced and makes them ring dead with the hollowness of the abyss. So the unspeakable, plausible deniability for covert operations overseas, at home. We start today with President Kennedy, under pressure from the CIA, military, and their corporate partners to win the Cold War. Kennedy's Joint Chiefs of Staff pushed the president to pursue the Cold War in Cuba and the rest of Latin America, and here's President Kennedy. We can't embrace every tin-horn dictator who tells us he's anti-communist while he's sitting on the necks of his own people. And the United States government is not the representative of private business. Do you know in Chile, the American copper companies control about 80% of all the foreign exchange? We wouldn't stand for that here. And there's no reason they should stand for it. There's a revolution going on down there, and I want to be on the right side of it. Hell, we are on the right side, but we have to let them know it, that things have changed. Tanay says, whoa. And they pushed Kennedy to pursue drastic options in other regions, including Southeast Asia. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Army General George Decker, and General Lyman Lemnitzer, and JFK. Burke, we have to be prepared somewhere in Southeast Asia to throw in enough to win. The works. Decker, if we go in, we should go in to win. And that means bombing Hanoi, China, maybe even using nuclear weapons. Lemnitzer, if we are given the right to use nuclear weapons, we can guarantee victory. JFK, these people are crazy. General MacArthur said the chickens are coming home to roost from the Eisenhower years, and I live in the chicken coop. In Vietnam, they suggested a nuclear strike. They kept pushing for combat troops. And what about the CIA plot to assassinate their president, President Diem of South Vietnam? JFK said, I've got to do something about those CIA bastards. He did. What did he do? In October 1963, he issued National Security Action Memorandum 263, authorizing the withdrawal from Vietnam of 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963, and by the end of 1965, the bulk of U.S. personnel. Tanay says, so, if JFK had lived, there wouldn't have been a Vietnam War. That's 50,000 American lives lost. 58,000 and 3 million Vietnamese. And a month before going to Dallas, where he was assassinated, President Kennedy decided to create his own back channel to communicate with Fidel Castro, just as he had done with Nikita Khrushchev. Fidel Castro met with President Kennedy's envoy on November 20th, 1963, and Castro said, Kennedy still has the possibility of becoming, in the eyes of history, the greatest president of the United States, the leader who may at last understand that there can be coexistence between capitalists and socialists, even in the Americas. He would then be an even greater president than Lincoln. I know that for Khrushchev, Kennedy is a man you can talk with. The next day, November 21st, Kennedy boarded Air Force One for Texas and Dallas. Meanwhile, scene 2, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King were drawing the support of thousands of people in their fights against racism and for civil rights. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Martin Luther King Somehow we must be able to stand up before our most bitter opponents and say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, we will still love you. Malcolm X. You don't have to have a turn the other cheek revolution. Anytime a shepherd, a pastor, teaches you and me not to run from the white man, and at the same time teaches us not to fight the white man, he's a traitor to you and me. Martin Luther King. Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement, which Malcolm X was a part, is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. It's made up of people who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. Malcolm X. Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. That's the old-time religion, an eye for an eye. Martin Luther King, the old law of an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, we wouldn't have any problems if we could get those two guys fighting, if we could get them to kill one another off. Unquote. No way, he said that? Hoover. Okay, so the FBI had done surveillance on black leaders almost since it began in the 20s. But under Hoover, in the 1950s and 1960s, black leaders were targeted under a program called COINTELPRO, an acronym for Counterintelligence Program. And here's from an FBI memo. For maximum effectiveness of the Counterintelligence Program's Racial Intelligence Division, long-range goals are 1. Prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups. 2. Prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them. They did surveillance, burglary, blackmail, trying to infiltrate, discredit, disrupt domestic political organizations. And 3, prevent the rise of a black messiah who could unify and electrify the black nationalist movement. They tried to drive a wedge between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad, and it worked. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm X announced his departure from the Nation of Islam, saying that it has gone as far as he could. He was prepared to cooperate in local civil rights actions in the South and elsewhere. To Martin Luther King and others, he said, as of this minute, I've forgotten everything bad that the other leaders have said about me, and I pray they can also forget the many bad things I've said about them. So Malcolm and Martin met for the first time and the only time in the nation's capital on March 26, 1964. They'd both been listening to the Senate's debate on civil rights legislation. Afterwards, they spoke together. They were interviewed. Martin Luther King, if the Senate keeps on talking and doing nothing, a creative direct action program will start. If the Civil Rights Act is not passed, our nation is in for a dark night of social disruption. Malcolm X, I'm here to remind the white man of the alternative to Dr. King. And they shook hands warmly. That must have given Hoover the absolute willies. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. came to have similar views against war, for economic justice, and each continued challenging the interests of those in power. So on the evening he arrived in Memphis the night before he was shot, King told a crowd of sanitation workers, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And Kennedy had planned his trip to Dallas as part of a difficult re-election campaign. For Kennedy, Dallas was a, quote, dangerous place, but he was undeterred. Speaking to his wife, Jackie, on their way to Dallas, JFK said, Jackie, if somebody wants to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry about it? The morning of his assassination, Malcolm, spoke on the phone with his sister Ella in Boston. His last words to her were, "You pray for me, Ella, because I firmly believe now I need it more than I've ever needed before. So you ask Allah to guide me, because I feel they have me doomed for this day. Ella, not this day, Malcolm X. Yes, this day." So on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy arrives in Dallas, rides through the jubilant streets in a motorcade. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King, still preparing for the march in Memphis, went out on the balcony of the Range Hotel dressed for dinner. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan. Here's Marika Matthews, eyewitness. Malcolm rose to the stage, and after a few moments of extended applause began, "Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam." Our attention was distracted by the man sitting directly in front of us. He jumped to his feet and yelled, "Get your hands out of my pocket." The accused guy gave him a dumbfounded look. Someone yelled out, "Hey buddy, take it easy." Then confusion reigned. Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's wife. "My husband! They're killing my husband!" Jackie Kennedy. His last expression was so neat. He had his hand out. I could see a piece of his skull coming off. It was flesh-colored, not white. And I can see this perfectly clean piece detaching itself from his head. Dexter King and Yolanda King. Dexter. To me, it was just like it was yesterday. I mean, I remember what I was doing the day he was killed. I remember details of everything. Yolanda. I was just 12 years old. For a long time, I pretended that he was just away. Because he was away a lot, it was easy to do that. I was an adult when I really mourned my father. I guess you never really get over it completely. Adela, Malcolm's 6-year-old daughter. "Dear Daddy, I love you so. Oh dear, oh dear, I wish he wasn't dead." Robert Kennedy ran for U.S. President in 1968. He had won 6 Democratic primaries before winning the California vote on June 4th, 1968. He was shot and killed after making a victory speech for supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Who shot him? The official story, Sirhan, a Palestinian-born Jordanian, was convicted of the crime. But here's Paul Schrade, Robert Kennedy's close associate, who was severely wounded in the shooting. You don't need anything but the clear-cut evidence to prove that Sirhan wasn't a lone gunman, as the LAPD contends. As The Guardian reported, February 22nd, 2008, acoustic forensic expert Philip von Prague concluded it is possible to make out 13 shots. That is more than 8 rounds that Sirhan's revolver carried. Also, there are 2 pairs of double shots that occurred so close together, it's inconceivable that Sirhan could have fired them all. All the official stories, lone nuts, black brothers killed them all. No involvement from anyone else. No conspiracies. Adrienne Rich, poet and feminist. Whatever is unnamed, whatever is misnamed as something else, whatever is buried under inadequate or lying language, this will become not merely unspoken, but unspeakable. So there are lots of issues with the official stories. But for today, one more example. The official report on President Kennedy's death said that the fatal shots all came from behind him. And yet, 21 out of 22 witnesses at Parkland Hospital, most of them doctors and nurses, trained medical observers, agreed in their earliest statements that JFK's massive head wound was located in the right rear of his skull, demonstrating a fatal shot from the front. So, the doctor's stories changed. How did the investigation conclude that the shots came from behind? Just after the assassination, the Secret Service took control of the body. But Dallas coroner Earl Rose resisted them, saying that Texas law and the chain of evidence required him to perform an autopsy before the body left the Parkland Hospital in Dallas. But the Secret Service pushed ahead with the coffin, and Rose stood aside. The president's body was flown from Dallas to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, and on the afternoon of the assassination, Dr. Robert Livingston, scientific director for 2 of the National Institutes of Health, he placed a phone call to the head of the autopsy team at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Dr. Humes, so he's the head of the autopsy team, Dr. Humes. Livingston says, "I said that if that wound were confirmed as a wound of entrance from in front of the president, there had to have been more than one gunman." At just that moment, there was an interruption in our conversation. Dr. Humes, head of the team, returned after a pause to say, "Dr. Livingston, I'm sorry, but I can't talk with you any longer. The FBI won't let me." Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink was the Army doctor who assisted Dr. Humes in the autopsy. So here's the president at Bethesda. They're doing the autopsy. Colonel Fink was questioned under oath later about the president's autopsy. Questioner: "Was Dr. Humes running the show?" Fink: "Well, I heard Dr. Humes say, 'Who is in charge here?' And I heard an Army general, I don't remember his name, stating, 'I am.'" Questioner: "How many other military personnel were present in the autopsy room?" "Oh, the room was crowded with military and civilian personnel, federal agents, Secret Service agents, FBI agents." Navy Medical Corpsman Paul O'Connor was also in the autopsy room. It got very tense. Admiral Galloway started getting very agitated about the wound in the neck. And I remember the doctors were going to check that out when Admiral Galloway told them, "Leave it alone. Don't touch it. It's just a tracheotomy." He stopped anybody from going further. Doctors Humes and Boswell, Dr. Fink were told to leave it alone. So after several questions related to the track of the bullet in President Kennedy's neck, Dr. Fink continued his testimony. Questioner: "I will ask the question one more time. Why did you not dissect the track of the bullet wound that you've described today that you saw at the time of the autopsy, at the time you examined the body?" And Fink says, "As I recall, I was told not to, but I don't remember by whom." So James Jenkins, who also assisted in the autopsy, confirmed that the doctors were obeying military orders. Jenkins: "In retrospect, he was also there. I think doing the autopsy in Bethesda rather than at Parkland Hospital in Dallas was a controlling factor. They couldn't control Humes. They could control Humes, Boswell, and Fink because they were military. And if we weren't controlled, we could be punished, and that kept us away from the public. That's why they cut him out of Dallas." Now, one of my favorite quotes of all. Charles Crenshaw, Parkland Hospital doctor. So he was a doctor in the Parkland Hospital that they took Kennedy out of. He says, "There was a conspiracy of silence. There was a conspiracy of silence. I believe there was a common denominator in our silence, a fearful perception that to come forward with what we believe to be the medical truth would be asking for trouble. Although we never admitted it to one another, we realized that the inertia of the established story was so powerful, so thoroughly presented, so adamantly accepted, that it would bury anyone who stood in its path. I was as afraid of the men in suits as I was of the men who had assassinated the president. I reasoned that anyone who would go so far as to eliminate the President of the United States would surely not hesitate to kill a doctor. Police and security forces were pulled back from their respective duties for all 4 leaders. The evidence and investigations were mishandled in all 4 cases. Police and others did more than that, but that's for another day. President John F. Kennedy. The great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. William Schaap, lawyer, author, and journalist. Disinformation is very, very effective over time. The longer that you can control the spin on a story, the more that spin becomes accepted as the absolute truth. And in this country, the government has had a great deal of power and influence over that spin. The Church Committee, Senate committee that investigated this stuff, reported that the CIA had thousands of journalists in their employ, and they owned outright 250 or more media organizations. Former New York Congressman Allard Lowenstein, civil rights advocate who pushed to reopen the Sirhan investigation based on new evidence, Lowenstein said, "It seems fair to say that there is now a rebuttable presumption that more than one assassination was involved in the RFK case. But what is even clearer is that nobody's making a serious effort to rebut that presumption. The notion seems to be that that presumption can be waited out, unanswered questions will fade away given time, and that the best way to deal with awkward new facts is to ignore them until they can be denounced as nothing new and then dismissed." The unspeakable, Jim Douglas. The unspeakable is not far away. It is not somewhere out there. We U.S. citizens supported our government when it protected our Cold War security by world-destructive weapons, when it carried out the covert murders of foreign leaders with plausible deniability, by avoiding our responsibility for the escalating crimes of state done for our security. We, who failed to confront the unspeakable, opened the door to the JFK's assassination and its cover-up. The unspeakable is not far away. Grossman, David Grossman, author. Better to hand over the job of thinking and doing and setting moral standards to those who are surely in the know. Better not to feel too much until the crisis ends, and if it never ends, at least we'll have suffered a little less, developed a useful dullness, protected ourselves as much as we could with a little indifference, a little repression, a little deliberate blindness, and a large dose of self-anesthetics. That is what we mean by mass denial, Martin Schatz, psychiatrist and author. The murder of the president is not a mystery. Any citizen who is willing to look can see clearly who killed President Kennedy and why. One of the primary means of immobilizing the American people politically today is to hold them in a state of confusion in which anything can be believed, but nothing can be known. And the American people are more than willing to be held in this state because to know the truth is to face an awful terror and to be no longer able to evade responsibility. It is precisely in moving from belief to knowledge that the citizen moves from irresponsibility to responsibility, from helplessness and hopelessness to action. Author James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
You're a conspiracy theorist.
I am.
Welcome. Do you happen to know where that term originated? Was it in CIA document 1035-960 concerning criticism of the Warren Report?
Okay, so basically this CIA report said we have to, they sent it to sympathetic news people, whether they were inside CIA actual connections or people that they knew they had good relationships with. And it basically said we must, I almost wish I had the quote here because it's so, maybe it's worth it to look this up as I'm going along, but we must, it's really important to refute the Warren Report. Conspiratorial arguments centering on the Warren Commission find such responses and their coupling with their pejorative label have been routinely wheeled out in various guises by corporate media outlets. Leaders to this day Okay, here's the things that they're saying in this document that they should say. No significant new evidence has emerged which the Warren Commission did not consider. Critics usually overvalue particular items and ignore others.
There it is.
You got it?
Yeah.
Critics has often been enticed by a form of intellectual pride. They light on some theory and fall in love with it. Oswald could not have been any sensible person's choice for a co-conspirator. Such vague accusations as, more than 10 people have died mysteriously during the Warren Commission's inquiry, can always be explained in some natural way. That is, the individuals concerned have, for the most part, died of natural causes. And so they're basically in here also saying that they invented the term conspiracy theorist to attach to anyone who raises these kind of questions, and to stick with the term conspiracy theory until we could be dismissed, anyone could be dismissed by being called a conspiracy theorist, and of course it's worked. And they had so many people that they could communicate this to, so many insiders in the media. And if you figure 250 outlets they own outright, and thousands that are, so that means every media organization of any size has someone that has a relationship with the CIA that can do certain work.
I also like a couple of other quotes. They're talking about the Reichstag fire in Germany in the 30s. They say, the Nazis tried to pin the blame on the communists, but the latter have been more successful in convincing the world that the Nazis were to blame. So the poor Nazis are getting blamed for that event. And then they say about the Kennedy assassination, a conspirator would hardly choose a location for a shooting where so much depended on conditions beyond his control, the route, the speed of the cars, and so on. And we know that Fletcher Prouty says that if he had remained in charge as he was supposed to be of the Secret Service on that day, the route would not have been what it was, and the speed of the cars would have been at least 44 miles an hour, whereas Kennedy's car was going at 8 miles an hour. The route was changed, and Fletcher Prouty had been restationed to, the South Pole or something. Now, what did you discover about Malcolm X's relationship to Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam? Because that's officially supposed to be the cause of his assassination, that he'd had a falling out with them. But it was, in fact, a divide and conquer move on the part of the FBI. How do we know that?
So, of the 4 assassinations, Martin Luther King's case, it's pretty clear. There was a trial, a civil trial in Martin Luther King's case, which nobody knows about, in which a jury found that the government was implicated in the assassination of Martin Luther King. It's more difficult with Malcolm because what we know is that that COINTELPRO was aimed at dividing Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. We know that letters were sent to Elijah Muhammad by the FBI that he assumed were written by Malcolm X, in which he was saying some challenging things about the Nation of Islam. We know that John Ali, who was a friend of his at an early point, had a relationship with the FBI, and that he was present in New York. He flew into New York the day that Malcolm was assassinated and left shortly thereafter without doing a lot of, this is what Jim's latest book is about those, but the most, of course, Malcolm himself is his own best witness about this, because he wrote extensively about his shift from believing that the Nation of Islam was against him. He was poisoned in Cairo, and he went to the hospital, and the doctor said, yeah, you've been poisoned, and in Cairo. And so they went back to find the waiter at the restaurant, and the waiter was gone. And Malcolm said, well, I know that the Nation of Islam doesn't have the money to finance an international spy network. At the night of his assassination, one of the assassins was arrested. Out of 4 or 5, I think there were 4 other people involved in it. The only one was arrested. Later, 2 other people were arrested and charged and did time for it. All the witnesses who knew these men who were there in New York said that those 2 men were not in the hall that night, the ones that did the time. Later on, the man who was arrested, who did do the shooting, named the other 4 who were involved in that assassination. None of them were ever arrested, charged, or questioned. So, so here's these 4 names, never investigated, never charged. The 2 people who were charged were, and did time, all the witnesses say were not even in the hall that night, all the people that knew them. And the man himself who did the time says, you know, I was convinced by the brothers that this had to be done, but there's just so much around it that it's hard to believe that, I mean, it's just too fishy, and it's too, so, however, because he was killed by other black men, and some of whom were a part of the Nation of Islam, it was probably the most successful of the assassinations of all 4, because it's the hardest to track down. But Jim Douglas in his latest book is doing it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the RFK assassination. I'm quoting from The Wilderness, which was Mike Rupert's website. An experienced and incorruptible scientist, then LA County Coroner Thomas Noguchi, steadfastly stood by his analysis of powder burns on RFK's head, which showed that the fatal wound was fired from more than 1 and no more than 3 inches behind Bobby's right ear. Interesting in light of the fact that none of the witnesses in the pantry that night placed Sirhan any closer than 3 feet in front of Kennedy.
That's right. So he's 3 feet in front.
Yeah.
All the autopsy agrees that the shot that killed him came from behind, in the rear, from no more than 3 inches. Nobody saw Sirhan get any closer than that. There were 13 shots fired on forensic analysis. His gun only fired 8.
Right.
There's really an excellent book called The Assassinations. Lisa Pease and Jim DiEugenio.
Yes.
On these 4 assassinations, really, they compiled articles. And Lisa Pease is very amazing. I mean, if you want to hear, I try to stay away from the most amazing and very convincing story about Sirhan.
I know the story. Yeah.
Just because it can't be independently corroborated as evidence, but it's very convincing. So anybody want to look into that? It has to do with all the experiments that were being done in the military at that time on hypnosis and post-hypnotic suggestion.
Yes.
No, and RFK. Sirhan, there's very strong evidence that Sirhan was a post-hypnotic, that he fired, you know, the girl in the polka dot dress.
Yes.
It's really interesting. It's a little bit detailed to go into now, but it's in this book. If you look up the assassinations, Lisa Pease has done some amazing writing on this. And by the way, the security guard,
P-E-A-S-E.
P-E-A-S-E, the security guard that was just behind Robert Kennedy, Euthane Cesar,
Yes.
had connections with what were the corporations?
Lockheed.
Lockheed. Worked for Lockheed, which has
and he was moonlighting as a security guard.
Yeah, moonlighting. He had just gotten that job like a night or 2 before, and has said some amazing things about the Kennedys in his past.
Well, Mike Rupert blames him.
Yeah,
Says-
right.
and says, somebody sue me, Mike says, somebody sue me, please, let's go to court.
Yeah. Well, and right now, William Pepper and Paul Schrade are trying desperately to reopen Sieren's case. He's still in jail,
Right.
but they can't get a new trial. Why? Well,
Well, I guess there's two other resources, because I mean the RFK assassination, even though it's probably a lot simpler than the JFK assassination, that I would encourage people to go to. There's a documentary called The Second Gun that I think was just put on YouTube within the last several years, but it was very hard to get before then. And it's really an incredible piece of investigative work that talked to all the early witnesses and basically questioned a lot of the politicians at the time. And it's by Ted Chirac. I don't know how to pronounce or spell Chirac off the top of my head, but if you look up The Second Gun and RFK on YouTube, you can actually see it. But it's a really incredible piece of investigative work that it was very hard to find for a long time. Another one that I highly recommend is The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy by John Turner and William Turner and John Christian, which goes into I guess interviewing a lot of the original witnesses, and some of the stories that they have in that book are pretty phenomenal. And it's investigative reporting that you rarely see, I think, in this day and age.
You said that was a book?
Yes, The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. I mean, I could, if you want, I could, later on, I could show you the links and things like that after the
Who are the authors?
presentation. Oh, I'm sorry?
The authors.
John Christian and William Turner.
Rob is an activist and political researcher who contributed to the 2006 documentary 9/11 Press for Truth. He serves on the board of directors of the Washington, D.C.-based Museum of Hidden History, founded by John Judge, and he also runs a tribute website for the pioneer anti-fascist researcher Mae Brussel at worldwatchers.info. Hi, Rob. Why don't you start out by telling us about Mae Brussel?
Okay, well, Mae Brussel is, in my view, is really the most prolific anti-fascist researcher of probably like the latter half of the 20th century. And the only person I would really kind of consider of her caliber that would be equivalent to her would be George Seldes, if you know who George Seldes was, whose work was equally as phenomenal. Let me bring up my website. And
what if I do partial? Is that work for you, Heidi?
okay. Now, I'm not a designer of websites by any means, but I do have I have about 800 of Mae's radio broadcasts posted to the wite, and you can listen to it for free. She basically was on listener-supported radio in California from 1971 to 1988, which was the year she died. And she initially started out basically just as a housewife who started studying the Warren Commission. And she amassed about 30,000 typewritten pages in terms of notes on the Warren Commission. She developed her own subject cross-index on the Warren Commission, and it was a phenomenal body of work at the time of her death. It was like 39 four-drawer file cabinets of work that, I mean, really is pretty unparalleled. But I mean, she was so big at one time in a certain sort of subset of people that Larry Flint actually gave her a political magazine called The Rebel, and it lasted about half a year, and then it was basically sabotaged. But I mean, you can actually go to my website and download the initial.
What is your website? I'm sorry.
Oh, worldwatchers.info.
Oh.
So this was Larry Flint's attempt to actually make a political magazine, and it was called The Rebel, and it had Mae's article, the Nazi connections to the JFK assassination.
Do you know Larry Flint? Yeah.
And basically, May was one of the first people to really pioneer the idea that Nazis were basically brought to this country after World War II using basically under Project Paperclip, primarily scientists, but it was many more people than just that. And in the early 70s, she was regarded as a crank for this, but 10 years later, the Department of Justice basically investigated the same thing, and May was completely on the right track. In addition to that, basically she was a mentor of probably the person who mentored me, a Washington, D.C. researcher who just passed away about a year ago named John Judge. And I really should talk about John, because John was somebody who I knew personally. John knew May very well, certainly for like about, I'd say, probably 20 years before she passed away in 1988. But one second, let me just get a picture of John. I think that looks like the obituary that he had, the picture he had for the obituary in the Washington Post. But John wanted to founded something called the Museum of Hidden History. And it's something I serve on the board of directors for, which right now is only 3 people on the board of directors. But it's sort of what he wanted as sort of the counter to the Spy Museum in D.C., which he basically viewed as a bunch of propaganda. And you know, he wanted people to learn, you know, this country's real history. And John really had a very progressive take on it, because usually I find in an environment like this, it's because this is like a very sort of progressive left forum, which I fully agree with. I mean, but at the same time, individual events like this and sort of questioning of events like this doesn't usually happen culturally, I find, on the left. It happens much more often on the right. And I find the research on the right is generally not very good. But there are a few progressive people who do this. Both May and John were both progressives. I would consider them, certainly John politically. And I mean, one of the most important things I learned about because John did a lot of work on a lot of cases, everything from Jonestown to the Reagan shooting to JFK and RFK to even UFOs and things like that, which are not, because that's a red flag for everybody. It sounds like a complete crazy talk when you bring something like that in. But if you look at it as something that is covert technology and nothing alien, in that people really were seeing something, but it was really just hidden technology as opposed, and you're getting a cover story for hidden technology, then it actually makes some logical sense. But I mean, I could go more elaborately into that, but I'd rather talk about certain things, I mean, that John really meant to me personally. Like, I mean, he was an outspoken activist who did counter-recruitment in the DC school system, and he was a real advocate for anti-racism and anti-sexism, which is something within sort of the conspiracy culture, people like Alex Jones running around, something that rarely gets addressed in any sort of way. And I think, you know, somebody coming from my background, which is a fairly affluent white background, you know, to have somebody who came from a similar background talk about the concept of anti-racism is very important, because in my background, you never, it's either something at best that's not addressed, or if it's ever brought up, it's usually something that's really terrible. And sort of that concept of learning what that, you know, you have to learn people's history and really learn to respect people's cultures, and anti-racism is really just you know, the way like somebody from a white background has to approach it. You have to understand racism is within you, and you really, you know, to say, oh, I'm not a racist really doesn't solve anything. And those are concepts that John really spoke to me with. And I mean, my wife is a person of color, and I've learned probably far more about these issues from my wife than anything else. But I mean, as a start, that was absolutely significant for me. And
but
then, yes.
You yourself have done research into the Chappaquiddick incident,
yes.
in which Edward Kennedy
yes.
was driving home from a party with a young woman.
Yes.
The car went off the bridge.
Yes.
And she died.
Yes. And basically Kennedy was left sort of holding the bag and gets smeared by the right wing, you know, until his death about how terrible a person he was, and you know, that he acted in you know, the most cowardly manner, and didn't report an accident for like 12 hours basically. And well, yeah, a little less than 12 hours, but I mean, I could go into that very elaborately. Can I just say one more thing about John Judge,
yeah,
though?
sorry.
I mean, one very key thing that John Judge really talked about, because John Judge grew up in D.C. and he discussed his mother worked for the Pentagon, and he became a person of nonviolence and peace very early on in his life, based on what he saw, I think, in his youth. And one of the things he would always talk about is, you know, everybody sort of blames the CIA, but really the more powerful institution historically in the U.S. is really the Pentagon, and they're not the same thing. The CIA has roots more of, I mean, it was only founded in the late 40s, and it has roots more to sort of like this Eastern Ivy League sort of element within the society, as opposed to the Pentagon, which, you know, if you look at the intelligence agencies under the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is within the Pentagon, that goes way back to, you know, naval intelligence and army intelligence back into the 19th century. And there's, I think operationally, there's far more things that go on in terms of the DIA and the Pentagon as opposed to the CIA, which John basically said was pretty much like a think tank, as opposed to, you know, anything that carried out any sort of serious operation and would really have to call upon the military to get anything really done. Now, you mentioned L. Fletcher Prouty before. L. Fletcher Prouty's job, he was this person who eventually sort of came clean about a lot of the stuff that was going on in the Pentagon. But from, I think 53 to 64, he worked in the Pentagon, where he was very, very high up in the Pentagon. And he was sort of the liaison between the CIA and the military for doing operations. And through that standpoint, he ended up seeing quite a bit. And he had, his key book is actually the Secret Team. And you can read it online. It's printed for free online at a good website is called ratical.org, R-A-T.
ICAL.
What about special operations? A different one?
Understanding Special Operations was something that Dave Ratcliffe actually did based on Prouty's work.
Right.
And Dave Ratcliffe runs this website, ratical.org.
So, but Secret Teams is a Prouty book that you recommend?
Yes, The Secret Team. And I mean, it's from around early 70s, I want to say, was when it was written. But there's still a lot of very interesting material in it. And here's John Judge again. But yeah, I mean, I could go into, I mean, I want to just probably touch upon just some of these things lightly, rather, because I could talk about Chappaquiddick for like 2 hours if you want.
Yeah, talk about John Judge's mother's story of the weekend following the assassination.
Sure. John Judge, his mother was basically worked in the Pentagon from, I think, like 42 to 72 for 30 years, and she was a manpower analyst. She was the highest paid woman employee within the Pentagon, and she was a manpower analyst who projected the national draft calls to selective service, and she had to be right within just a couple hundred people either way with when she would do her annual projections to selective service, I believe. And she said that she had, up until 1963, she had never been told to change her projections ever. And in April of 1963, it was the first time she was ever told to change her projections for recruitment. And it was basically to project for a complete withdrawal of all American personnel from Vietnam by the end of 1964, not 65, but 64. And if you look at what Kennedy was doing at the time, he in Jim Douglas's book, he talks about speeches that he was giving that were basically about peace. If you see his American University speech and things like that, I mean, he says things in that speech that no sitting American president has ever even touched, remotely so, ever since. And And so he wanted to run on the '64 election really on a peace ticket, not to get elected and then take everybody out, but actually do it, actively while he was still in his first term. And so basically Kennedy is killed on Friday, November 22nd, and she was told on Monday, the 25th, Monday the 25th, that to change her projections again by the orders of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And basically and John said this, and I'm certain John did not, exaggerate this at all, because I know John pretty well, or knew John pretty well. And he said to plan for a 10-year war with 57,000 dead, which meant that they knew exactly where they were going. And they just had to get Kennedy out of the way, because Johnson would have basically gave them their war. And to me, this is something that, in probably in a conference like this, unfortunately, it's not really dealt with that much, because from that perspective, and I grew up with Noam Chomsky. I read lots of Noam Chomsky books when I was in college, and to him, there's no difference between Kennedy and Johnson. They're all just the same ruling class, terrible person, and there's no difference between the two. And to me, there's a difference even between people I don't like Reagan and Bush. There's a total difference between those two. And even if it's just intersecting class warfare, that it's very important, I think, to study the rich in this country and understand that they're not monolithic. There's a lot you can learn by sort of studying the divisions amongst the rich. That could lead me into talking about the Reagan shooting, which is actually, I believe, was a coup attempt on March 30th, 1981, with Bush basically Reagan, I think, was supposed to be dead, and Bush was supposed to become president, but he didn't die, and I think for all effective purposes, Bush was really a 3-term president as a result of that. But I could go into the evidence of it. The clearest piece of evidence that it was an actual coup that day was that there was a scheduled presidential succession exercise for the next day called 9 Lives. It's referenced in Caspar Weinberger's book Fighting for Peace. I think it came out in about 1990. I can actually show it to you on my webpage if you don't believe me. But it really was right here. In Caspar Weinberger's book, Fighting for Peace, he mentions a FEMA presidential succession exercise, 9 Lives, scheduled for March 31st. And that's a photograph of that page in the book. So I think the coincidence of that is pretty ridiculous if it could mean anything else. I think they basically were planning for the succession to happen, and it didn't happen because, or the exercise didn't happen because Reagan survived. But there's a lot of other things in that, John Judge did an unbelievable amount of work on that incident, and I probably don't have time to really go into much of his work, but it's a really, I think, a really fascinating piece of American history that nobody ever really sort of deals with. But you can see that, like the John Hinckley Jr., his father had ties to George Bush going all the way back to the 60s. And they had a relationship with Vanderbilt Energy, which was owned by John Hinckley Sr., and Zapata Offshore Oil, which was Bush, and Bush basically was giving money. You can find, actually, in one of these articles, I believe, it references money that was being given from Zapata to Vanderbilt in like maybe 1962 or 1963. So their relationship goes way back. And actually, in the Washington Post at the time, there was a dinner between the brother of John Hinckley Jr. and the son of George Bush that was supposed to happen, that was canceled because of the shooting.
Neil Bush.
Yes, I believe it was Neil Bush and Scott Hinckley who were supposed to have dinner together, and I don't know. I mean, my skepticism goes way up when I hear something like that. So, but sort of in the American press, it's never, none of these issues are ever, nobody even bats an eyelash at when they hear something like that. I'd like to, do you have any questions, or is there anything I'm being unclear about that I'd like to work in more of a conversational format?
Well, I'd like to know if the Museum of Hidden History exists and where.
Well, it's physically right now, it's sort of like John amassed like this massive amount of stuff. And I mean, he had books, rare books, newspapers. I mean, it wasn't quite what Mays was, but it was very sizable. And so he inherited other people's archives too. And right now it's in basically a condominium in Falls Church. And from what I know at this point, I mean, we have some funding, but we need to basically get the funding to have like a real sort of museum where I mean, because John's vision was really to have, you know, kids, you know, on field trips come to this and get sort of an alternative to the, you know, the propaganda that when they go to the Spy Museum or something like that, you know, really have something that's going to educate in a fairly broad-based manner. I mean, if you see the people that endorsed it, it was people from Howard Zinn and I think Amy Goodman. 1 second, let me look. There it is. And so yeah, we haven't updated the website yet, but yeah, if you go to museumofhiddenhistory.org, that's sort of where to start with it. And knowing how John was, I mean, he would want it to be as collaborative and inclusive an entity, I think, that it could ever possibly be.
Just as an idea, I mean, I totally support this, but maybe as an interim, they could possibly maybe scan all the stuff there and get
all of John's stuff.
Yeah.
You know, the thing is I mean, I've spent here, like, Dave and I have spent a lot of time, like, say, on May's shows. So if you go back to, like, some of the older shows here, she used to do, you know, she used to do basically like a 2-page reference sheet for each radio show. And so Dave Ratcliffe and I have, you know, maybe like for 1 year's worth of shows, we put these in. The problem is the manpower involved with that is just to do this is huge.
Yeah.
But to do, say, May's archive or John's archive, it would be unbelievable. Just, I mean, the amount of effort. And it would have to be pretty much all volunteer work too, which makes it even harder. I mean, I mean, at this point, it's just sort of turning people on to these ideas because, you know, I mean, usually, I once showed the second gun at the Park Slope Food Co-op, and literally, it was like me and my wife there, and then one person showed up, and another person showed up but had to leave early. And, you know, and that's what I'm used to dealing with. It's nobody really, these aren't issues that really sort of, even to the activists, you know, even in that realm, it sort of gets put by the wayside. Even though I find that people, once you know, they hear these issues, they take to them and they find them really interesting.
You want to talk about, you know, what's available to you, Chappaquiddick or Son of Sam?
Oh yeah, because I'm related to one of the major figures in the Son of Sam case. Because does everyone know what that one is?
No.
Son of Sam was a series of killings that happened during the summer of 1977. Actually, it was about a year that happened, and it ended in 77. But he was, I mean, it was basically a series of, I think it was 13 murders. And it happened primarily in the Bronx, Queens, a little bit in Brooklyn, and he lived in Yonkers. And my uncle actually was the arresting officer, which sort of made it, like, I don't know, I guess closer to my heart in some sort of weird way. So I pursued it more so than I would maybe some other things. And there's actually a really good book on it called The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. And what my view is basically there's, I think, very good evidence that he was anything but just this lone, crazed serial killer. And that the killings involved at least 3 people, but probably involved a cult that was operating out of the Yonkers area. that involved, dozens of people at least within that cult. And there was so much evidence that there was so much more to this case that the Queens DA, John Santucci, in I think 1982 or 1983, actually reopened the case. It's something that's pretty hard to find any information about now at this point, but each person that he kept investigating that was basically connected to Berkowitz, every time there would be heat on this person, that person would end up dying. So the investigation basically didn't go anywhere because everybody that was that could have potentially been connected to more people kept dying. So in very suspicious circumstances. And there's other evidence that, what I'm sort of saying is that I think it was connected to probably either like a cult or something that existed even possibly nationwide in a certain capacity. I'm trying to describe this in a very short amount of time, but a lot of the family members, for example, don't agree with like the conventional story. Family members of the victims and some of the victims who survived. Berkowitz knew details about, there was a murder in Stamford, in the church in Stamford. Somebody named Arliss Perry was murdered in a really horrific fashion in, I think it was 1974. It was in the early 70s. And Berkowitz knew details about that murder that were not publicly released yet. And the only way, theoretically, that he would have been able to know those details is through sort of like this cult network that was basically sort of committing, these terrible acts, basically. And so what this leads back to me is the idea of, I don't know if you've heard of the term strategy of tension, but it goes back to Europe. And I can read you a definition of the strategy of tension. It's basically a theory that Western governments during the Cold War used tactics that aimed to divide, manipulate, and control public opinion using fear, propaganda, disinformation, psychological warfare, agent provocateurs, and false flag terrorist actions in order to achieve their strategic aims. And primarily in Europe, it was used due to fear of Europe going socialist and communist, basically too far to the left. And there was an operation that was exposed called Operation Gladio, which was consisted of provoked terrorist incidents in Italy and other European countries that it was intentionally designed to keep that country, moving to the right in terms of political perspective. And the theory that May and John had, and I think this is probably correct, but it's hard to put all the links together, that a lot of these incidents that particularly occurred in the 70s that effectively moved the society over to the right were basically incidents that had a little bit more intention in them than just like random crazy things that happened and people want as a reaction, more law enforcement and things like that. But I could give you, I think Son of Sam potentially could have been something like that with, and this is theoretical, this is not something I can totally prove, though Maury Terry gets pretty involved with making that a logical assumption within his book, Ultimate Evil, which I think is a really, really good piece of work. My family doesn't really like it because they're a bunch of conservative Catholics, but I think it's actually an incredible piece of work.
What's it called?
The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry.
So the victims of Son of Sam,
yes,
they had nothing particularly, of interest, but it was just this general creating fear and then.
Well, I think it works in several ways. I think when something like that happens, what Berkowitz said is that, because if you looked at the mugshots, they look all different. They don't look like the same guy, and so they came up with these, the police came up with these weird theories about maybe he was wearing a wig and stuff like that. It seems more likely that it was multiple people committing these murders. And what Berkowitz said is that there was one, of the 13, there was actually one very important murder that had to happen. And that they actually had an outside professional killer come in and commit that murder, one of the Queen's murders. but it sort of, in a sense, gets camouflaged by all the other murders that are happening. And actually, there was a really, Hollywood takes from this sort of stuff all the time, actually. So if you look at like that movie Jack Reacher with Tom Cruise in it, the whole thing is like, you know, all these people just getting randomly killed, and it looks like a random killing, but it's really to disguise the killing of one person that's really supposed to be killed. And so these are concepts within covert operations that you constantly see happening, and you see it happening in this country, but nobody really seems to sort of put it together. And a good example of that was potentially like the DC Sniper, where Linda Franklin, who was an FBI agent, was killed, and she was basically the FBI counterpart to Valerie Plame, who was, you know, outed and taken out in her own way. Well, Linda Franklin was supposedly killed by the DC Sniper, but it's possible that that was just either one murder that was thrown into the DC Sniper. The DC Sniper could have been a whole operation. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the thing is when you're looking at credible people, I think, that do this sort of stuff, you have to be willing to hear people that are willing to tell you, I don't know. And, you know, I just, you know, it's possible, you know, I'm looking at primary sources, things like that, but, you know, very often you don't know. And, but I think, you know, if you look at a few other cases, I can't really go into them, just I think due to time, but like the Symbionese Liberation Army, the Weather Underground, elements of the Manson family Tate LaBianca killings, and things like that, you can really go into, you know, sort of things you're not normally going to, I guess, associate as elements of those things. But I think there's a lot more to all of those things. So,
Definitely.
Yeah.
You want to talk about Manson?
Well, I mean, Manson is actually one I've not really looked into that much. I just, you know, I haven't had the time.
Okay.
But I mean, the interesting thing about Manson, I guess if I could say something really fast, is, you know, the cover story that's sort of in the Helter Skelter Vincent Bugliosi book is sort of like that. The Manson family wanted to create a race war, basically, and they wanted to pin. They basically put evidence in the Watts section of LA that would potentially lead back to the Black Panthers maybe committing these murders. That's why they put death to the pigs. And at least they said that, you know, they wanted to create a race war called Helter Skelter. And before it was about a year between the murders and when the Manson family actually was caught. And there's there's somebody who was an operative who goes all the way back to the JFK assassination named Ed Butler. And he was in the famous sort of Oswald radio debate where Oswald was basically exposed as a Marxist and as a defector to the USSR. And he basically ended up going, after the Kennedy assassination, going out to California and writing for this big magnate, this very wealthy guy named Patrick Frawley, who founded Schick Razors. And he wrote an article in this Patrick Frawley publication called Did Hate Kill Tate? And basically this was several months before the Manson family were actually caught. And he basically, in that article, outlines the entire cover story about how, you know, maybe the Black Panthers did this, and this was long before they, you know, were ever caught. And so it says that maybe, you know, there were deeper ties to what the Manson family was actually doing, especially if somebody like Ed Butler was saying sort of the same thing. But beyond that, you know, there's some good books. Ed Sanders' The Family, and there's another one that I can't think of off the top of my head right now. It's not a topic I've spent that much time on. A little bit just reading about in relation to the Son of Sam case, but that's really about it.
You want to go for another 5 minutes?
Me? Oh, I could, yeah. I mean, I could
Well, I
talk
wonder
about.
if we wanted to just see if there's any other final, you know, I mean, we've been talking and blathering away.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any comments that other people might have or particular questions.
I have a question, a curiosity, I don't know if you, your Project Unspeakable sounds amazing. Like I work with the high school youth, so I can see them because they're so tired of being talked at and given information. You know, they love theater and getting into it, so I would love a couple of extra of these to take back to my school. But my question is, today's youth, they seem very far removed from these four figures. That's ancient history to them.
Yeah.
One person that they relate to a lot, an unsolved mystery case that they, you know, seem to think the CIA was involved, is Tupac Shakur. Any chance of incorporating him in there somehow? Or do you have any information?
I don't,
No?
but
Well,
it,
I mean, well, there's some, I mean, I don't know how deep it really went necessarily. There's been some good work on it. I can give you some names of people who do work on these things, and one is a guy named John Potash, who I know did work on, certainly on the Tupac Shakur case. Well, Nick Broomfield's film, Biggie and Tupac, is really good too, if you want to show a video. I mean, I like Nick Broomfield's documentaries. I think he's a really good muckraker. And
What's the name of the film?
I think it's just Biggie and Tupac.
I can say that the the new version, the theatrical version that we're working on, there's a young woman who was part of the laboratory that helped us to reconceive it, is a Muslim, African-American Muslim woman who lives in New York, whose father converted to Islam at the same time when Malcolm X was still alive and still working in Harlem. In 1962, he converted. And so the new version of Project Unspeakable, all of this information is, she's a film student, and she's working on her master's thesis.
What's her name?
And her name is Tanae. Oh, you mean the actress, Naja. What is Naja's last name? That's a very good question. I'm not remembering her last name right now, but I could, if you want to know, I can look it up afterwards. And she, in the story, is a graduate student, not the actress. The actress that helped develop it, helped to develop the character of Tanae. So Tanae in here is the one that says, I had the dream. There's no longer a character in the play that says, I had this dream. The character that says, I had the dream is now a Muslim African-American student, film student, and she's working on a documentary film, and all of the stories of these 4 assassinations are her film. So she sits here editing, and you're seeing up behind projected a lot of and then the actors come stepping out of that. And she has a sister named Deja, who is what she is self-described as a mipster. I don't know if you know this term, a Muslim hipster. It's young Muslim women who wear the scarves, stay within the Muslim religion, but at the same time are pushing the feminist aspects of it. How far can we carry out the sensuality? How beautiful can we be? How can we continue to, so they're pushing, they're doing a feminist revolution within Islam. And her sister becomes convinced by Tanae and goes to a rally at her mosque and is shot. And then, so that the new theatrical version has been rewritten and reimagined by young people for the very reason that you're talking about, is how does it become more interesting to them? So that script isn't available yet, but that will be finished soon, and I'm hoping by the fall that version will be out. And that isn't to discourage you at all about Tupac.
You had a question?
Well, I was just going to comment, I think, on the MOVE people from the MOVE, Pan Africa, and Ramona Africa, and Ralph Pointer, because I believe they're in touch with the political prisoners, like Mutulu Shakur, his father, and Asada, it's his mom or his aunt. They're both political prisoners.
Oh, really?
So they would probably know, and they're in different forums here, if you want to
Thanks.
try to connect the dots.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you all for coming.